Wow, look at those fireworks! What do you think of when you see fireworks? Perhaps you think of a certain country? How about China? Did you know that fireworks and more significantly gunpowder were invented in China in the 9th century CE? They are both part of China's historical legacy of self-sufficiency and are great reminders that Europe has never been the only place making progress and scientific discoveries in the world. While Europe was rapidly industrializing in the 19th century, China was self-sufficient and organized, exporting goods like porcelain and tea to Europe while importing almost nothing. Today we'll explore what happens next in the relationship between these two powerful regions as European imperialism clashes with Chinese isolationism. We'll use the following questions to guide us along the way. How did the Opium Wars impact China? What was the significance of the Taiping Rebellion? To what extent did China's isolationist policies succeed in keeping out Western influence? We'll also explore this big picture question throughout the video. Is free trade always free and beneficial for all countries involved? China was mainly isolationist throughout its history, meaning it remained socially, politically, and economically separate from other nations. China had a strong agricultural economy that helped it feed its growing population. China had also developed its own extensive mining and manufacturing industries based on salt, tin, silver, and iron. These provided work for tens of thousands of laborers and produced high quality silk, cotton, and porcelain. The centralized government strictly controlled trade coming into and out of China. In fact, trading was only allowed in their southern port of Guangzhou. Basically, Europe needed China more than China needed them, and Europe was not happy about it. Europeans were determined to find a product China wanted, and this turned out to be opium, an addictive narcotic made from the poppy plant. For centuries, Chinese doctors had been using opium from India and Egypt as medicine. Then, in the 1700s, British merchants began smuggling massive amounts of the drug, which was produced on British owned poppy fields in India for non medicinal use. The Chinese government tried to ban opium and imposed strict punishments for its use, but England continued to smuggle the product into China's ports. By 1835, an estimated 12 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. This soon led to the Opium Wars, a series of diplomatic, economic, and naval conflicts between Britain and China over opium and economic imperialism. China went to war for several reasons. First, opium caused health problems in those who were addicted. Second, China was now importing massive amounts of the drug, which was disrupting its economy. And third, internal conflicts over opium were creating societal issues. China wrote to Queen Victoria in 1839 requesting that Britain stop smuggling opium, but Britain refused. England claimed to believe in a concept called free trade, that all countries should have open and equal access to trade with all other countries. Does this sound like something we've talked about before in history? If you said capitalism, you're right. The concept is based on capitalism and argues that the world would benefit from the free flow of goods. In Unit 7, we learn that capitalism is the idea that competition in an economy leads to the best goods being provided to consumers at the lowest price. Free trade is essentially saying the same thing, but on a global scale. When China continued to close its ports to English ships, battles broke out at sea. Britain's steam-powered gunboats easily defeated Chinese ships. After suffering several defeats, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which gave Britain the island of Hong Kong. The island became a center for Western influence and trade. The Chinese government was then forced to give extraterritorial rights to the US and other foreign countries in 1844. This meant that foreigners would not be subject to Chinese law at Chinese ports, further opening China's markets to opium and other European goods. Pause here to answer the following question. How did the Opium Wars impact China? As anti-Western sentiment increased, China also faced several domestic challenges. The first was rapid population growth. In 60 years, the Chinese population had increased from 129 million to 430 million by 1850. Despite their advanced agricultural practices, food production just couldn't keep up with the rising population. The second challenge was the ever-increasing rates of opium addiction in the country, which created many problems for the Chinese people. Unrest continued to build until it spilled out in the form of the Taiping Rebellion. This was an uprising led by Hong Xuan that aimed to create a new China built on equality. Hong Xuan began recruiting followers in the 1830s. He wanted to create the Taiping Tingwao, or Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, where wealth would be shared and no poverty would exist. This might sound a bit like the concepts of socialism and communism that you learned about in Unit 7. That's because one of the important aspects of the Taiping Rebellion was that it was a reaction against Western capitalism and laid the seeds for socialist movements in China in the future. He successfully organized over 1 million peasants into the Taiping Rebel Army with the goal of seizing control of large areas of southeastern China. In response, the Chinese government sent Qing imperial troops, aided by Britain and France, to defeat the Taiping rebels. The Chinese army eventually dismantled the Taiping government in 1864. While the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, it demonstrated the internal unrest within China, weakened the Qing government, and planted the seeds of communism. Finally, it was one of the most deadly uprisings in history, with about 20 million people dying from fighting, disease, and starvation during sieges. Pause the video here to reflect on the question, what was the significance of the Taiping Rebellion? While the Taiping Rebellion was squashed by the Qing government, unrest rooted in fear of Western influence continued to plague China. Empress Dowager Cixi, who reigned over China in various forms from 1862 to 1908, implemented several reforms to try and suppress foreign influence. She created the self-strengthening movement of the 1860s, which updated China's education, diplomacy, and military, and established factories for the production of steam-powered gunboats, rifles, and ammunition. While the movement strengthened China to an extent, other nations continued to assert control over the country. Several European powers, as well as Japan, had gained footholds in China, exerting economic imperialism in a sphere of influence or area whose economy or politics are influenced by an outside power, even if they had no formal authority there. In 1860, the Russian Empire gained full control of Manchuria, a large territory in northern China, through an unequal treaty with the Chinese government. As the US was becoming an imperial power, they were worried that Europe would follow Russia's lead and divide China into colonies, like those in Africa, and that the US would be completely shut out. Using the same argument that free trade was beneficial to the world, the US established the open door policy in 1899, which European powers agreed to. The policy established that China's doors would remain open to merchants from all nations. China would remain free from colonization, and the U.S. trading rights in China would be protected. The open door policy did help prevent China from being colonized by European powers. However, China was once again forced to participate in the global market despite its wishes and became subject to economic imperialism. Let's pause the video here to answer the question, to what extent did China's isolationist policies succeed in keeping out Western influence? Western influence in the name of free trade led to economic, cultural, and societal pressure on the Chinese people. This unrest manifested in the Taiping Rebellion and later in nationalist uprisings in China. In our next lesson, we will be staying in China to continue to watch its transformation because history is everywhere. Hey, hey.